Hello folks, welcome back to World War II TV and the beginning of Armoured Actions, and you can spell Armoured with or without the U depending on which nation you are from, but Armoured Actions is our subject this week. And during the course of this week of programs, we're going to be taking you to North Africa and the Eastern Front and Normandy and other various places, New Guinea, but we're actually going to start first ever on World War II TV. We're going to talk about a battle that occurred in the Spanish Civil War. So I'm kind of breaking my own rules of sticking to World War II because the subject matter connects with World War II. And basically, towards the end of the show, we'll be discussing whether or not the armored actions in the Spanish Civil War influenced a lot or influenced a little bit what happened in World War II. And to help us go through this project, you may know him better on Twitter as Rivets and Pins. Pete Blanchard is going to be talking about this battle. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce him. As always, if you're new to the channel, if you haven't already, click subscribe, click the little bell so you get notifications and share what we're doing on social media. But that's it. I'm going to introduce Pete now. Good evening, Pete. How are you doing?
Yeah, fine. Thanks, Paul. Thanks for inviting me on the show.
So, I kind of said it there in the introduction there. We separate in some ways the Spanish Civil War and World War II several years past. We talk a bit about the aviation parallels and people talk about ME-109s and things like that. And as we will find out, it was the first time, in a sense, Soviet, German, British kind of tank tactics, tank designs were kind of given a run out, not in a large scale, but they saw some action there. And I guess the world was watching. But before we get into that, I've got to ask you, where did your interest in armor begin, and why, particularly when I was putting the feelers out for shows about armor, what struck you about the Spanish Civil War? So why do you like tanks? Why the Spanish Civil War?
Yes. I guess, like a lot of people, certainly in the UK, if you go back about 50 years, you'll see little me making Airfix kits, playing with model soldiers, watching war films. I'm a lad of sort of the late 60s, early 70s, that sort of generation. So it's that sort of cultural influence that gets you interested when all the other kids are making models too. But as you grow up and as Airfix gives way to sex and drugs and rock and roll, I still maintained an interest in sort of tanks and armored vehicles. I don't know why. Maybe it's that cultural thing lingering on. But when I actually got my degree, which was in Spanish, which kind of brings us back into the story for this evening, I did my degree in London on Spanish, then went to work for a certain automotive manufacturer for 32 years. So that kind of kept the interest in armor, certainly from a technical and a design and development perspective. So when I retired 3 years ago, I kind of got back into old hobbies and started again looking back at armor, but not from a, this has got a gun on it, that's got that sort of gun, the top trumps.
The top trumps version, yeah.
Exactly. It's more the sort of development, design. Why did they put that suspension on that vehicle? Why didn't they build more of these instead of these, etc.? It's that sort of using knowledge from my career, looking back at that sort of really interesting period of time when they were designing tanks from the First World War to World War II, all that change going on, what was happening, why, etc. So that's where that comes in.
And that's one of the benefits of living when we do now, because you can hop on YouTube and you can see a clip of whatever tank you pretty much want to see running around somewhere at a museum at Bovington or the USA. So we have that much more access to looking at how things work. We can get the Haynes manuals and understand chassis and suspensions and guns, and perhaps when we were building our Airfix kits, we only had that little bit of information that came with the kit. Or if we were lucky, there was a one-page in a Warlord or Commando comic about an M5 Stuart or something, but we didn't have the access we have now. And also the historiography. We've got people who have been talking about tanks for a long time now, so we can look at what they were saying in the 50s, what they're saying now, and we can talk about it. Anyway, without further ado, we're going to take us back to the Spanish Civil War. So Pete has come with a PowerPoint presentation, and he will guide me through it. And basically, over to you. And folks, if you've got questions, kind of fire away as we go along. We'll do some at the end. We'll do particular kind of conclusions we'll do at the end, but details about the presentation we'll kind of do as we're going along. But without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Pete, really.
Okay, thanks, Paul. So as I was saying, worked for an automotive manufacturer, degree in Spanish, and tonight we're seeing an interest in tanks. So it all comes together this evening when we look at the Battle of Seseña. But before I get into the Battle of Seseña, it's probably a good idea to give a bit of background. Reason being, whenever you mention the Spanish Civil War, the usual retort tends to be, aha, training ground for World War II. Yes, but no. So I'd like to just sort of run over that as well. And then from when the war starts to when we see the Battle of Seseña take place, again, to give you a bit of background as to what's happening and why. And so you understand, you know, what are these forces fighting each other and what for it, and so on. So let's rewind back to the First World War. So about 1916, 1917. Spain is not participating. Spain's got its own problems. It's a very agricultural society, very conservative society, and there was a lot of inequality going on. So you've got a lot of people, the haves and the have-nots, the rich, the poor, industrialists, landowners, blah, blah, blah. The rich and the poor, the people who tend to work in the factories or obviously on the land. Lots of social unrest going on. And of course, you get the Russian Revolution. What happens? The have-nots rub their hands and think, oh, this could work for us. The haves look at this and think, oh my God, we don't want communism happening here in Spain. A couple of years roll on, 1921, and the Spanish army gets a bit of a bloody nose. The Spanish Empire, which extended from Mexico down to Argentina, the Philippines, that's all gone. But the Spanish Empire still exists in small bits. And one of those small bits is Spanish Morocco. And the army is down there keeping the lid on local discontent. But in 1921, at the Battle of Annual, the Spanish army gets a bit of a punch on the nose. This goes down at home like a lead balloon, as you might imagine, you know, a national disgrace, etc. So that and the social unrest, things not going that great. And within 18 months or so, there's a coup. A general by the name of Miguel Primo de Rivera takes over and spends the next year being effectively the dictator who runs Spain under the king, because Spain's still a monarchy. Unusually, when you get a right-wing dictator, the people on the right, the conservative element of society, tend to, yeah, they quite like that, and they benefit from that sort of thing, and the have-nots don't like it. Well, this guy manages to achieve something almost quite unique. He manages to offend virtually everybody. So you get to 1930, he can't go any further. He resigns. So the king, Alfonso XIII, who's I think was the great-grandfather, yeah, of the current Spanish king, he puts in another general, Berenguer, who fumbles on for another year or so. He goes, and then somebody has a word with the king, you know, Your Majesty, you remember what happened in Russia in 1917? Well, that could well happen to you, so maybe time to leave. So Alfonso abdicates, and you get what's called the Second Republic. Elections, and a leftist government comes in. The pendulum swings the other way. So they try and work a very fine balancing line between not scaring the right wing, not scaring the haves, but keeping the have-nots content with land reforms and things. Kind of goes on for about a year, and then there's a coup attempt. A general, Sanjurjo, tries his luck, fails, gets put into prison with some of the other officers. But within, what was it, another couple of years, the government falls, more elections, a rightist government comes in, and there's an armed rebellion up in the north in Asturias, in the mining areas. The miners rebel and there's an uprising. So the government calls in a general from Africa, because what's happened in Africa since that bloody nose was given to the army, they've come up with the Army of Africa, which is a much more well-equipped, trained, and ruthless force, which suppresses any kind of resistance or any kind of opposition in Morocco. So they bring in a general from Africa by the name of Franco, you might have heard of. He brings with him some of the Army of Africa, and they go about suppressing the uprising in the north. using their various bloody methods and even some artillery. That is put down, but within a couple of years, the government stumbles, falls, more elections, and in early 1936, you get a leftist government coming in. They, again, try and continue the reforms. They were looking at before, etc. The problem is, in those elections, fewer than 1 million people voted for centrist parties. Most of the population voted for extreme parties either on the right or on the left. So the country's getting really polarized. And then you start to see political assassinations happening on a more or less regular basis. And it all comes to head in July, when on the 17th of July, some army officers stage a coup in an attempt to take over the government and rule Spain from there. The coup fails, the Spanish Civil War begins. So if we can go to the first slide, please, Paul. Oh, we got it up already. Well done.
Yeah, we got it ready. Yeah.
You can mind read. That's what I like. After a day or two, things start to settle, dust settles, and you can see that, you looking at my wonderfully coloured map there, the blue area is where the rebels have staged a coup. They've risen up, taken control, and they hold that territory more or less. So you've got a bit in the south around Seville. You've got a lot up in the north, in the conservative north of Spain, and in the northwest. Also, most of the Balearic Islands to the right, Spanish Morocco also, and the Canaries, which aren't on the map. They all go with the rebellion. The rest of it, the north coast, which is where the Basque country is, a lot of the coal and heavy industry is, the centre and the eastern country stay loyal to the government. So it's kind of 50-50. So it's like, okay, what happens next? Well, if we look at who's got what kind of force behind them, what sort of military forces and paramilitary forces you've got, you get an idea of what's about to happen. Now, the government has still got the loyalty of most of the army, certainly the army on the mainland. That was about 110, 115,000 strong, but 95,000 of those stay loyal to the government. That sounds good, but in reality, it's like the military will complain of in many countries in peacetime. It's been underfunded, but chronically underfunded. Although the resources have been poured into Morocco, really, in the military there. So what you've got is an under-resourced army where some units don't actually have proper uniforms, don't even have weapons, but they've got the manpower. Most of the navy also stays with the government, except for the bit that operates out of the northwest coast of Spain up at the top there on the left. Most of the urban police, there's always at least two flavors of police in Spain. The urban police at the time were called the assault guard. It's a name that tickles me. Imagine getting a parking ticket from an assault guard.
Assault guard, yeah.
Most of those guys stay loyal to the government, and about a third of the rural police, the civil guard, you still see today, stay loyal. Then you've got various militias, workers' militias, trade unions, etc. So quite a lot of men in terms of, well, and with the militia, women as well. With the rebels, you've got the remainder of the mainland armies, about 20,000 men. You've got the majority of the civil guards, some of the assault guards, and you've got various right-wing type militias, fascist militias, the Falange Party, for example. But importantly, the Army of Africa, this relatively new force, which has been sort of set up in Morocco to keep order, suppress any kind of uprisings or opposition, is persuaded to go with the plotters, the conspirators, the rebels. And that is really that's their top card, if you like. This is the only part of the army which has got combat experience, if you want to call it that. It's anti-insurgency experience. They're well equipped, got uniforms, the whole lot. And And just to give an idea of who they are, it's not just sort of Spaniards over there. You've got, it's in two parts really. If you think French Foreign Legion, the Spanish had a similar sort of outfit, the Spanish Legion. Very professional, ruthless, well equipped. The other part, probably the greater part, was what was called the regulars, the Fuerzas Regulares Indígenas. And these guys were effectively locals, Moroccans, working, or in these formations. They had Spanish NCOs for the most part, Spanish officers. And again, when there was any opposition or attacks on Spanish assets, all of these guys would be, or a proportion of these would be taken to the appropriate area. Then what you'd find is that they would go in, locate the resistance and eliminate it. So taking no prisoners. Then anybody who looked like they might be resistance was probably also taken out and shot. Anybody who looked like the second cousin removed of somebody was also subjected to that. Then you've got sort of looting, rapes, etc. And then once they're finished, they'd withdraw from the area with their trophies, their ears and heads and sexual organs of the victims. And that's kind of the way they worked. So you can kind of get the impression from all of that, that if you're going to have these sort of people on your side, then it's probably going to work, things are going to work in your favor. You've got the most sort of combat ready formation there. The problem the rebels have got is these guys are in Africa. They're on a different continent. Okay, if you look at the map, the Straits of Gibraltar aren't that wide, but when you've got to get 32,000 men across them, and the opposing navy is, well, what's the word? They control the Straits of Gibraltar.
They control the waters, yeah.
Yeah, you're stuffed. And it's at this point that the rebels put out feelers to Germany and Italy, to sort of very sympathetic nations, shall we say. Now, until now, Germany's not really taken that much interest in what's going on in Spain. For them, it's a bit of a backwater. But suddenly Hitler realizes that, hold on, if we help these guys win, we can obviously have a government down there which is friendly, sympathetic to us. It will get rid of any fear of having communism appear in Western Europe. And it obviously, having a sort of fascist type government in Spain will give the French something to think about on their southern border. Sounds good. So they immediately send down a fleet of Junkers Ju-52 transport aircraft to Morocco, where they start the first ever airlift in history. Likewise, the Italians. Mussolini is up for this as well. He sniffs glory. He's looking at being king of the Mediterranean, Mare Nostrum and all that. So, yeah, he wants to help them because, as I say, smells glory. He can have a sympathetic government on the west part of the Mediterranean, leaving him free to do what he wants with the rest of it. So, good stuff. So,
and worth mentioning, just to interrupt there, Pete, but worth mentioning as well that when we talk about the Mediterranean campaign in the Second World War, then the two important bits are the Suez Canal at one end and the Gibraltar Straits other end. So any kind of long-term interest in the Mediterranean, that southern bit of Spain and Gibraltar, that's a strategic area.
Absolutely. And in the Second World War, pressure is put on Franco to consider taking Gibraltar along with German forces.
Yeah.
As we know, it doesn't transpire, fortunately for Spain and everybody in Gibraltar. So the Italians sent down a load of Savoia Marchetti, was it SM-81? I think I'm not too hot on planes, SM-81 bombers to Morocco. And with the German aircraft, they begin ferrying over hundreds of troops per day from, I think it's about the 2nd of August or so. And they fly those over to Seville. Now, what we can see there on screen is the plan. They come up with a plan because obviously they bring these troops in. They what do they do with them? Well, it kind of splits into two. There's a little plan and a big plan. The little plan is to send about 400 or 500 troops eastwards to link up with the successful rebellion in Granada. So one of the colonels, Barela Iglesias, is sent with his small band of troops eastwards to link up with the rebels there and extend through southern Spain. But the main body of troops is concentrated in Seville And the plan is to send them north, link up with the rebel territories in the north, and then march on Madrid and take Madrid as soon as possible before the government manages to build up any sort of kind of serious defense there. And that's what happens. So early August, the plan is put into operation. The troops that go north are motorized infantry, effectively. They're all put on trucks. The commander, Colonel Yagüe Blanco, nearly forgot his name, he splits his column into sort of, I think it's 3 or 4 different mini columns, and they all head north on different axes. So he's got motorized infantry, they've got some light field guns, got some air support from some of these Italian and German aircraft as well. And they head north. And they basically do what they were doing in Morocco. They would get to a village or a town. If there's any resistance, they would crush it. People would be taken out in the street and shot. Anybody benefiting from any of the land reforms would have the land taken away from them. They'd probably be disposed of as well. And then the men were let loose to rape and loot the village or town. Then after an hour or so, they get back on the trucks and move off. So very brutal, very nasty. I mean, war's a nasty business, and civil wars are even nastier. So that's the way they progressed. And this had sort of kind of 3 effects. It allowed the troops to sort of quench their bloodthirst. It spread fear amongst the people who were in the path of these columns. So it made it easier to conquer them because people were fleeing. And then, what's the third one? There's a third one, but I may come back to that.
We'll circle back to that when we remember. Yeah, it's brilliant stuff so far, by the way, Pete. We're loving it.
Thank you. So anyway, these columns head north. But then Yagüe is contacted by Franco. Yagüe is told, turn west. Or is it, I'm not sure whether that's west or that west on camera, but hey, turn west. He asks why. You know, he's got a timetable to get to Madrid, take the capital, etc. The reason being a city called Badahoth. And if we look at, I think it's the next map on there.
Just put it in. Yeah.
Thank you. You can see the arrow takes a turning to the left, to the west, towards Portugal. Badajoz is, at this time, is a city of about 40,000 people. Anybody who's interested in the Napoleonic War and the Peninsular War in Spain and Portugal will know that there was a siege here when Wellington besieged the city and took it in quite a battle back in 1812. The column of death, as it's now called, for obvious reasons, reaches the city. But it's an old walled city. It's still got its old walls. They've been repaired since Napoleonic times. They can't actually get in. But due to some sympathetic army officers inside, the rebels managed to get in. Now, I think there are about 2,000 militia guys in there, government militia, so, you know, workers effectively, and about 500 troops who are loyal to the government, or most of them are loyal to the government. But when we talk about militia, we're not talking about well-armed militiamen with rifles and machine guns and grenades. We're talking about people with pitchforks, axes, knives, maybe a shotgun. If they're lucky, they're given rifles by the local barracks. You know, this is not a well-trained, well-equipped force, whereas who's coming in is. And of course, what happens is that the rebels get inside and a massacre occurs. There's running battles in the street, and the militia are sort of turning, they're running, they're being shot down, they're being hunted down and murdered. Even so far as the cathedral, some militiamen run inside seeking sanctuary. They're pursued inside and murdered inside. They're shot on the altar steps. And in fact, one of the chaplains, the chaplain of one of the columns, goes inside, discovers a militiaman hiding in one of the confession boxes, pulls out a pistol and shoots him. Parish priests, eh? Once that they take the city, it doesn't stop there. That evening, 2,000 people are rounded up as being suspected of either working for the government, supporting the government, etc. Rounded up, taken into the bull ring, and machine gun 20 at a time. This goes on all night. The columns move off, but the killing doesn't. That carries on for days and a few weeks, and it's been estimated that over 4,000, so that's a tenth of the population, are actually executed as a result. Now, as you can imagine, it's been small towns and villages up until then, but of course, you're getting what's the word? Journalists. That's the word. Journalists are starting to hear rumours. They're visiting Badahoth and want to know what's going on. So, of course, the rebels put out the story that, yes, there have been some arrests. We've taken prisoners, but they're all being treated fairly and justly according to the law. Okay, fine. Lots of blood for sticking to the law, but hey, there you go. The column goes off. But one American journalist, John Whitaker, catches up with Yagwe, and he's granted an interview with Colonel Yagwe. And he thinks he's going to get the same answer as before, that everybody's been treated fairly, blah, blah, blah. And he gets to the question that I've heard a lot of, about massacres going on in Badahoth. Can you tell me anything about that? People being executed. Yagwe turns around and says, well, I've got a tight deadline to get to Madrid. What am I going to do? I can't take 4,000 Reds with me, so effectively owning up to the fact that, yes, a lot of people were put to death in the city. The columns carry on, making, as I said before, pretty good progress, 40, 50 kilometers a day. They link up with the rebel-held territory, carry on. They don't stop what they're doing because, obviously, not every village and town has been taken by the rebels, even though nominally they hold that area. All going well as far as Yagwe is concerned, and then he's contacted by Franco again. Yagwe, take Toledo. Great, says Yagwe. This is the second time I'm being told to change direction. You do realise I'm not going to get to Madrid on time. When I get there, they're going to have built barricades, concrete defences, etc. I'm going to lose men taking the city. Franco didn't want to hear about that. He sacks Yagwe, replaces him with Barella, the other colonel, and Barella is told, take Toledo. Why? Again, Franco sniffs a PR opportunity here. Not only that, he probably does actually feel sorry for the people he wants to rescue. And who are these people? They are army officers, civil guards, officer cadets and their families who have been holed up in the castle of Toledo. And if we can see the next photograph, please. It should be there. There we go. Oh, that's a much better photograph.
I swapped it for a better one. Yeah, I did that.
Yeah,
yeah.
And as you can see, that's an old, I think it's an old Moorish, old Arabic castle which has been built on. Overlooks all of the city, the river, and everything. And of course, when at the time of the rebellion, the government maintained control of Toledo, even though there was a significant uprising there. And all of the rebels escaped into the castle with their families. They took some hostages. And that was the beginning of July. It's now the beginning toward the end of September. So for 2 months, these people have been holed up in there. What they've had to endure is assaults on the castle, attacks from all directions. And it was a mine, in terms of the First World War, where you dig a big tunnel underneath the enemy trenches, fill it full of explosives and blow it up. That's what happens in Toledo. So by the time the rebels get there, there's not much left of it, as we can see there. So in the ruins, the rebels are still holding out. And these are the people that Franco, to give it this correct Spanish pronunciation, he wants to rescue these people. And obviously it's a big PR propaganda exercise, plus the fact he gets another city under his belt. Barella arrives at the city and it's a repeat of Badajoz. They relieve the siege. They rescue the people who are left in the castle. Obviously all the hostages have been shot. And then another massacre takes place. Horrendous things. For example, a hospital is taken. It's got about 200 wounded Republican soldiers in there, and they are dispatched with grenades thrown to the hospital wards. A maternity hospital is taken. About 20 expectant or mothers who have just given birth are taken out, put on a truck, taken to the cemetery and shot. Ruthless, horrible stuff. Not to say that similar things didn't happen in the government zones, it did, but this is pretty bloody stuff.
And just to ask maybe an obvious question, Pete, but we're talking about rebel territory and government-held territory, but you can't tell me that every single person in the government territory is supporting the government, everybody in the rebel territory is supporting the rebel. It must have kind of been that clear cut. As either side are moving into areas, is there an attempt to kind of convert people to the side, the victorious side? How do you identify who is who? What can you just, as an individual, say, I didn't support this? How does it work in terms? I'm thinking of how Eastern Front in World War II. Yeah. Just give us an idea of how it works.
As you say, it's difficult. There were people who supported the coup hiding in Madrid for most of the Civil War. You'll probably find that there were people in the rebel-held territory who supported the government still. But what you tended to find is that in each territory, there were bands of people going around looking for these, what they would view as traitors, yeah? Okay. And they, so in the rebel-held territory, anybody suspected of, or anybody known to belong to a trades union goes on the list. Anybody being part of a leftist political party goes on the list, etc. Likewise, in the government areas, landowners. If a landowner has been particularly nasty, then yeah, he'll go on a list and he'll quite possibly disappear. Priests, monks, the church was identified with the right wing, and by the end of the war, up to 300 nuns had been murdered. So, a lot of it's clear cut. People knew who people were, and it was run along those lines. And of course, you get people dropping names because they didn't like them. So those people would disappear.
Wow. Yeah.
Nasty stuff. Anyway, after the massacre at Toledo, Varela then splits his force into three. Sorry, is there one before there? If not, it doesn't matter.
No, there isn't.
Oh, okay, not
Maybe
to
there
worry.
should be, but if there isn't,
there isn't now. Okay, Varela splits his force into three, and what he does, he sends part of his force directly north to the west of Madrid. So imagine Madrid's there, west of Madrid. One column heads directly for Madrid, and one actually goes south of Madrid unexpectedly, with the aim of taking Madrid from the south or from the east. This panics the government. I mean, the government's already panicked. It's already moved from Madrid to Valencia on the east coast. But they realise that the column is coming quick, it's coming fast, it's coming bloodily, and it's almost on the doorstep of Madrid. By the time we get to the Battle of Seseña, they're only 40 kilometres away, 25 miles, not a lot. So the government orders some kind of counterattack, some kind of blocking operation to stop the taking of Madrid. Now it's here they get lucky. The Germans and Italians are by now they're furnishing the rebels with lots of aid, light tanks, guns, small arms, artillery, planes, you name it, it's coming in. Middle of October, a ship docks. If you look down at that map of Spain in the southeast corner, there's a port there called Cartagena. It's a naval base. And I think it's around the 15th or so of October, might be out by a couple of days. A ship arrives from the Soviet Union. The Soviets have now decided to give military aid to the Republicans. The Soviets, like the Germans and Italians at the beginning of the war, signed up to a non-intervention pact. Basically, Britain, France, and the rest of them didn't want this spiraling into another European war. It's less than 20 years since the last one. So a non-intervention pact is put into operation. Nobody gives military help to Spain. Let them fight it out themselves. Of course, the Germans and Italians, behind everybody's backs and to everybody's knowledge, really, start supplying the rebels. And after a while, Stalin ums and ahs and then decides he'll help the Republicans because guess what? It's in his interest to have a left-wing, stroke socialist, stroke preferably communist government in Western Europe. Great stuff. So middle of October, this ship arrives. Lots of aid on there, armoured cars, guns, artillery, you name it, it's on there. And it's all being sold to the government. None of this aid comes cheap. The Germans were selling their material to the rebels, as were the Italians, and the Soviets were doing the same. So they were taking Spanish government gold in exchange for all this armament at very attractive prices for the Soviets. The tanks which were on that ship are taken off and they're moved up to a little village or town called Archena, which you might be able to see if you squint to that map. It's just in the southeast corner. I'll put it in red, so it's kind of a little bit
just under the Y of territory, isn't it?
Yeah. That's the one. That's the one. And this has been selected by the Republican Army. I'm going to call them Republicans now. The government government forces, the Republicans. They've selected Archena as a pretty good place where they can bring the armor in from the port, which they know is coming from the Soviet Union. There are quite a lot of facilities in Archena, so they can house the Spanish tank crews who are going to be trained there. They can house the Soviet advisors, because Soviet aid never comes without advisors. And they can turn this into a training area, and if you like, a tank depot from where they can prepare tank units and send them up to whichever front they want to send them to. Within a day or so of the tanks arriving, they arrive at Archena. The Soviets are quite happy with the facilities and they start training. Now, this is where it gets a bit Mr. Bean. The Soviets arrive, and these are experienced tank crew. 3 men per tank, commander, gunner, driver. So lots of commanders, gunners, and drivers turn up with the aim of training the Spanish. The problem is the Spanish candidates who have been selected or picked to be tank crew don't speak Russian. Guess what? The Soviets don't speak Spanish. So quickly, a kind of training happens via hand signals. So you've got that turns the turret right, that turns the turret left. This is how you turn the tank left, right, that kind of thing. Very basic, but kind of does work in the end. Within about 10 days or so, the order comes from Valencia, from the government. Tanks, Madrid, now, please. Obviously, we haven't got Spanish tank crews trained up. You can't train a tank crew up in a couple of weeks, not to do things thoroughly. So 15 tanks are taken, stuck on a train with Soviet crews, but with some Spanish gunners. Some gunners have been judged to be, yeah, you're doing right, you're doing fine, we'll put you in the tanks. They're put on and they're sent up to the Madrid front. And they're under the command of a gentleman whose photograph we should see coming up next. And here he is, Captain Ardman. He's actually Latvian. I can't pronounce and I can't recall his proper name, but he changes his name from a surname which begins with T, and he calls himself Paul Ardman. Now, he's quite an interesting character. It's a nice photograph of him, obviously Red Army officer, speaks Latvian, speaks Russian, spent a lot of time in France as a lad, as part of his education, so he speaks very good French. Apparently spoke one other language, one other European language too. As I say, a bit of a character, not lacking self-confidence at all, this man. When he gets to the Madrid area, it's explained to him what has to happen. They've got to take his tanks with some infantry and they've got to stop the rebels advancing and push them back to Toledo. And somebody sort of says, well, we could be facing up to 15,000 troops here. This could be, really bad. At which point Ardman turns around and says, 15,000 troops? I've got 15 tanks. What's the problem? Okay, cool.
Good to be confident. Very confident,
indeed. So from there, Ardman takes his 15 tanks up to Madrid. Now, with a bit of luck, the next photograph is a nice colour photograph, and that's the one. That's the type of tank he takes with him. It's a T26 tank. Some of you will know what a T26 tank looks like, and that's it there. For those of you who are not that familiar with it, it's a fairly light medium tank by British standards, developed by Vickers in the late 1920s. And when they took it to the British Army to say, hey, how many of these do you want? The British Army looked at it and said, well, call that a medium tank. It's a bit on the small side. What's that funny suspension? Oh, I don't think we like this at all. Thank you, Mr. Vickers. So Vickers turned around and then started touting it around other countries to see if he could get, or they could get any orders. And the orders came in. They sold pretty decent quantities of tanks for the time to places like Siam, Uruguay, China, Poland, and the Soviet Union. The Soviets like this because it's a small, compact tank. It's fairly simple, robust. It doesn't take a great deal of training to get people to be effective with the tank. So yeah, we'll take some, please. Oh, by the way, can we build them under license? And by the time I actually finished building these in 1941, they'd built over 10,000 of them.
Yeah,
quite a lot of these things. What they did do, though, they replaced the British turret with a Soviet-designed turret, put their own 45mm gun in there, which could fire armor-piercing at tanks, fire high-explosive at infantry and anything that could be blown up. Had a machine gun on it. As I say, crew of 3. Commander, you can see the commander in the top here. The driver's hatch is open, so that's where the driver sat at the front, and you had the gunner inside firing. This thing it wasn't particularly fast, go about 18 miles an hour, 30 kilometers an hour downhill, weighs just under 10 tons. Not much armor on it, but for the time it was adequate. 15mm at the front, so it will stop any bullets coming at it. So yeah, all round, not a bad little vehicle. And that's what went to Madrid. So there's that, if you like, is the end of the first part. That takes us from...
And and the motivation, and correct me if I'm wrong, Pete, for any of these nations, if they're selling their arms, be it aircraft or tanks, they're actually making some cash, which is first win. And the second win is they don't, if the war doesn't go their way, it doesn't really affect them. But they also get to see how their tanks perform. And if they've got their officers there, so it's kind of a win-win. Whether you're German, Soviet, or anybody, you can't really lose at this. You're seeing your tanks in practice or your weapons, and you're getting a bit of cash. So that's kind of, I guess, is that a simple way of explaining why they were so willing to supply?
Yeah, I mean, the primary motivation was they saw, they saw benefits in doing so.
Yeah,
as you say, they weren't going to lose money on the bench. They weren't giving these things away.
Yeah.
They weren't giving things away. They were hoping to get a sympathetic or pliant government in Spain. So yeah, you're right. It kind of is literally a win-win situation for them.
Brilliant. So bringing us up to the battle now, which is part 2. We start part 2. Great.
We start part 2 now. Before I start, there's a caveat to come in here. As far as the Spanish Civil War is concerned, this is a rather well-known battle. It's the first major tank battle of the war. Lots of things go on. It's a battle of firsts. The first time Soviet tanks are used outside the USSR, things like that. We'll come to that later. But the problem is there's a lot of rubbish been written about this battle as well. So when you're trying to look into what happened next, who did what, when, at which stage, there's a lot of conflicting information, both in Spanish and in English. You read stories about anti-tank mines blowing up the tanks. Well, there wasn't an anti-tank mine for miles. T-34s, oh, come on, guys, description, some really poorly described or translated material. You might as well take a copy of Viz and sort of, stick the vibrating bum-faced goats in there. So there's a lot of stuff that you've really got to sort of filter through to get to any kind of
as you said at the beginning, Pete, because you speak Spanish, you've got double the chance of getting to the mystery because you can source 2 languages at least. So you got double the opportunity of finding the truth. If you're just studying this in English or just in Spanish, you're stuck with one set of sources. So it's giving you a bit of a head start right at the beginning.
Indeed. And in fact, it's the Spanish sources which, I guess they're able to possibly access material more easily than English only speaking authors or researchers. And I've based the following account on 2 sources. One is a blog run by the people behind a Twitter account, Bel Martis, and the other is on a presentation which a local group in Madrid, Gefrema, which stands for the Grupo de Estudios for the Frente de Madrid, which is the Madrid Front. It's all back to front in Spanish, like in French. Madrid Front Study Group. Local enthusiasts who've got access to lots of material, eyewitnesses, etc. So there's a presentation by one of their guys, Fernando Lopez Monterrubio. It's on YouTube, but unfortunately only in Spanish. And again, gives a really detailed account. And he draws some other sources as well. So this is what I've based my account on. So before we start the actual battle, this is, if we can keep that on there, that'll be great, actually. That's kind of the environment we're looking at, and I'll get onto that in a second. But before I do, what I just wanted to do is to sort of say, okay, who is fighting who here? What have we got? What are the two sides? Do the two sides look like? Republicans, the government forces who are going to be trying to counterattack and push back the rebels. They've got the 15 tanks coming up from the southeast. And they've also got a mixed brigade of infantry. Now, the mixed brigade, I don't think was necessarily a new concept, but it was the first time it was put into practice. And what they're trying to do is have a big enough infantry formation of about 4 battalions, which would have enough of its own support services and weapons to almost act like a small division. It's been called a pocket division. So it would have a squadron of cavalry, it would have organic artillery, engineers, medical, etc. And that was the idea. So you'd have about 3,500 troops forming one of these mixed brigades. Now, the first mixed brigade, because it literally was the first one formed and thrown into action, it was put together on the 18th of October. The battle we're about to look at happens on the 29th. So this unit's been in existence for precisely 11 days. So you can imagine the amount of training it's done on its own. Not a great deal. I don't think many of the support units were with it. I don't think there's any cavalry, but you had 4 battalions of infantry. You had some supporting artillery, that's for certain. 5 battalions of artillery. The problem they had is that there wasn't enough supply of shells coming through. So the barrage they managed to put up wasn't that great. But you had the artillery anyway. You had the tanks. You had some air support coming in. And there were some other irregular infantry units to guard the flanks and so on. So quite a decent sized force. You're probably looking at about sort of 3,000 to 4,000 men, maybe more. Now, on the other side, on the nationalist side, in other words, those holding Seseña, those who have been sort of pushed forward, part of the advance, pushing forward to try and take Madrid, you only had 700 men in the town. Bit of a motley crew, to be quite honest. You had 2 brigades of naval infantry, Marines, with some machine guns. You had a squadron of dismounted cavalry, effectively running as infantry. You had some Moroccan irregulars. So these are not the guys with the Spanish officers. These are basically a bunch of Moroccan gunmen. Sounds wrong, but yeah. I can't come up with a better description at the moment. And you had a couple of field guns in there. Now, overnight, before the battle, they're actually reinforced by a couple of companies of Moroccan regulars, and a couple more pack howitzers come in. So about 700 men, limited amount of artillery to defend themselves with, and a couple of machine guns. And they were under the command of a gentleman called Captain, Andres Sanchez Perez. Experienced officer. He's come from Morocco, so he's got some experience or combat experience under his belt. He knows what he's doing, and he's been given the task of holding on and defending Seseña while the next stage of the advance happens. So that's who we've got. Now, to go to the photo we've got on screen, this is typical of the countryside around there. Spain is a very mountainous country in general, the second most mountainous country in Europe after Switzerland. But the area around the south of Madrid, around this sort of area around Seseña, is quite flat, undulating. It's, as you can see, it's agricultural land, and there's not much cover. Yes, we've got a couple of olive trees up there by the look of it, but not much else. So anybody moving during daylight here could be seen a mile off, several miles off, in fact. If we can go to the next slide, what you've got there is the main street in Seseña. This is called the Calle La Vega, and this runs from the east side of the town to the centre. And we'll be looking at this, or the action. A lot of the action takes place in this street. But if you can imagine, take away the bollards and the pavement, take away the cars and any sort of lampposts, anything like that, and that's more or less what it looked like in 1936. Probably in black and white, because everything was in black and white back then. But that's our main road that we're going to be looking at as we drive into the city, the centre of the town. Now, on the next one, that's your main square. It's actually triangle, you know, from an English perspective, it's a triangle, not a square, but it's a square. It's called the Plaza Bayana. It's the main square, the main sort of central place in the town. The building on the right at the back is the town hall, and behind the building on the left, you can see the spire of the church. Have we got another photograph over? Yes.
Back streets, yeah, the side streets, yeah.
Yeah. So I just selected this particular street. No particular reason why. I'm not aware of anything special happening here. It's just to give the impression of how narrow the side streets are. And if you look at that, you don't really want to take a load of tanks down there. You know, you can have things thrown down on top of you, etc. So narrow side streets. Your main street is probably quite navigable in a tank. So that's what Seseña looks like. You've got a main street running east to west, a square in the middle, and you've got lots of side streets and backyards and alleyways and bits and pieces. So that's what we're looking at. Now, the photo we got there is a lovely photograph that an Italian pilot took in about 1938-39, right over the top of Seseña. So this is after the battles happened, but obviously with the Civil War on, there's been no sort of major developments in terms of the structure of the town. That white triangle in the middle that you might be able to pick out, that is, in fact, there we go, lovely, thank you, Paul. That's the main square, the Plaza Bayana, and if you look to the right of that, that is the Calle La Vega, the main street that runs from the east side to the centre, and then you can see a road leads from the centre off west. So that's the town that the battle takes place in, or most of the battle takes place in. Now, it's the morning of Thursday, the 29th of October, 1936. October. This part of Spain, going into late autumn, winter, starts to get very chilly at night. Very chilly indeed. So 6 o'clock in the morning, the troops are all lined up at the start line at Cuesta de la Reina, some kilometers to the east of Seseña. It's quite misty, and the artillery opens up on Seseña. Those 5 barrages, or 5 batteries, get my barrages and my batteries unconfused. 5 batteries open up on Seseña. A light barrage happens. As I say, not a great deal of ammunition, so we're not looking at the barrage at the start of the Battle of El Alamein, for example, or anything on the Eastern Front. You know, these are relatively light guns, not many shells, but it's morale boosting for the troops about to attack, and with a bit of luck, it does some damage at the other end. At the same time, the air attack, which is supposed to also descend upon Seseña, doesn't happen. The planes just don't materialize. The barrage ends, and at 6:30, the whistles are blown. The infantry begins to walk across country, down across the land towards Seseña. At the same time, the tanks start, well, their engines would have been started up by now, but they rev up and they begin to trundle down the road towards Seseña, single file. The commanders are sat in their hatches, and the drivers are driving down with their front hatches open, so they can see where they're going. It's misty, no reconnaissance has been done, so that they don't know exactly what's what. They don't even know at which point they're going to bump into the enemy. So the tanks rumble off. According to one account, it's all very romantic, but apparently the tank crew starts singing the Internationale as they drive off into the mist. All sounds wonderful, but I have my doubts. The tanks trundle off, and before you know it, they're moving at 25-30 kilometers per hour down on a gentle slope down towards Seseña. They quite quickly leave the infantry behind. After about 10 minutes, aircraft noises overhead. The planes finally turn up 40 minutes late. They fly in towards Seseña, ready to drop their bombs. These are biplanes. They're Russian biplanes, light bombers or fighter bombers. I'm saying not the greatest aviation expert. And what happens is they fly over Seseña and start bombing villages behind Seseña. So nice try, but not quite. They bomb Borox, they bomb Esquivias. We know that in Esquivias there were rebel forces, so maybe they actually did some damage. Who knows? But
okay,
they tried. 7 o'clock, the tanks arrive in Seseña. If we can go to the next photograph, here we have it. Now, you need to have a bit of imagination here. You need to go back to 1936 and think, well, there were no lampposts. All of that building on the right was not there. The walls on either side of the road were not there. The railings on the left, those black railings, weren't there. No pavements, no tarmac, or possibly some tarmac if you're lucky. The road sign wasn't there. But what was there, apart from Seseña in the distance, was a chapel. And you can see that on the left. You've got a chapel. It's white with a terracotta roof. Been done up since then. But that was there. And the tanks draw up there as there's a roadblock on the road. Overlooking them is one of the field guns that the rebels have got. And as the tanks pull up, an army officer at the roadblock steps out, puts his hand up and shouts out, "Halt. Alto." The tanks stop. And that's where the first confusion begins. Because the guys on the roadblock, the sentries, have seen, like, first of all, they hear tank engines. What's going on? They then, through the mist, start to see tanks coming towards them. Uh-oh. Are they ours? We don't know. They call back to the village. Sanchez Perez, the guy who's got command of the village or the town, comes out to see what's going on. He can see these tanks approaching, but they're not in battle formation. They're in single file. He can see the commanders on top, and as they get closer, he can see that the driver's hatches are up. So this is hardly an attack force as he would know it. Then he realizes that he knows there are Italian tanks in the vicinity. They were fighting the previous day to the west of Seseña. Maybe these are the Italian tanks, because he's been told they could well be passing through. Are they Italians? Are they enemy? He doesn't know. So puts up his arm, shouts, "Alto." The tanks obviously roll up and stop. The commander in the first tank, who is Captain Ardman, shouts down to Sanchez Perez in French, because although he speaks Latvian, Russian, French, and one other language, that one other language isn't Spanish. So he thinks French is probably going to do here. Shouts down in French, words to the effect of, "Let us pass. We're off to combat the enemy." Sanchez Perez, who can really only hear sort of tank engine noises, and hears this guy shout something which doesn't sound very Spanish, thinks must be Italian. So he shouts up to Ardman, "Italiano!" At which point the peseta drops on both sides. So they both realize, oh, it's the enemy. Sanchez Perez and the guards at the barricade run. Ardman gives the command, hatches down. This is it. We're going into battle. And that's what happens. Now, it's kind of at this point where things get a little bit confused. Some sources say that all the tanks drive through Seseña. 15 of them drive through like that. Other sources, and the Jefrema guys seem to believe this is true, and it seems to make sense to me also. Some of the tanks went north of Seseña round, and others went via the south, sort of kind of enveloping the town. the truth is, at the moment, we don't have anything concrete to say either or. But what I'm going to do, if tanks did go around the town, I'm going to ignore those, because what we do know is that a small number at least, did go through the town, and that is documented.
So they're the ones we're concentrating on.
They're the ones we're concentrating on.
Yeah.
So they start to move into Seseña. Obviously, with the hatches down, we're looking at tank technology, which is, we're not looking at Shermans or Panthers, where you've got a commander's cupola and you've got periscopes and they can look out and see what's going on. These guys have got very narrow vision slits in the side of the turret. Your gunner has got his gun sights, and the driver's got, again, a thin sort of slot to look through. Not easy to actually see who's firing at you and to be able to fire back. And of course, they come under fire from the defenders. Now, the defenders are more or less in the same position as the German infantry when the first British tanks appeared. They don't have any anti-tank guns, anti-tank rifles. All they've got is literally the munitions, or the armaments and munitions they've got with them. So they begin to fire their rifles, pistols, machine guns, throw grenades, whatever they can at the tanks. And of course, not a lot is happening. The tanks begin to trundle into the town, slowly firing at what they can. And when they come across trucks or cars or carts carrying supplies, they basically machine gun and blow them up, wrecking as much as they can as they go through. After about 45 minutes, they get near the main square in the middle. One of the tanks, the tank in the lead, rams what is either described as a farm car or a truck. Bit of a difference between the two, but again, records are a bit sketchy here. It rams it and tries to drive over it to crush it. Unfortunately, whatever it's trying to crush gets jammed in the suspension and the tracks, and the tank can't go forward, tries to reverse, can't go back, it's immobilized. So that tank stays there while the others pass it by into the main square. And you get a kind of sort of Mexican standoff in the main square, because the tanks are firing at what they can see, but they're not having that much impact on the infantry who are firing back at them. And the infantry who are trying to fire at them are firing from windows and just ducking down, coming out of alleyways, throwing grenades. And by this time, they're actually throwing rocks and stones at the tanks, anything to try and do some damage to these things. Then somebody comes up with the idea of tying cloths round rags, setting light to them, throwing them on top of the tanks in an attempt to try and burn them. And it's around this point, by this time, it's getting on for gone 9 o'clock in the morning. Ardman realizes that if they just sit in the town waiting for the infantry to turn up, things could get rather unpleasant. They've already got one tank disabled. If they stay and sit around, things could get a lot worse for the rest of them. So he decides to move off, and they trundle off west. I think the next slide shows the tanks moving along west on the little map. There you go. Yep. And they shoot off towards Esquivias down the slope. Now, you may be thinking, yeah, okay, what's happened to the infantry? Why has it taken them so long? They set off at 6:30. It's now gone 9 o'clock, 2.5 hours to get a few kilometers. Well, as it turns out, the infantry did descend down the slope, over the rough ground, the ploughed fields towards Seseña. After about 1.5 kilometers, a lot of them were complaining they got sore feet, sore ankles, getting a bit tired. So they decided they wanted to sit down. So they had a rest. By the time they had their rest, continued down and got to Seseña, obviously the tanks had gone straight inside the town. And the defenders on the eastern edge of the town had regrouped. And as the infantry tried to assault the east side of the village or town, they were met with some pretty solid fire. They started taking significant casualties, and they decided the best thing to do was to pull back. So the infantry don't actually make it to Seseña. They pull back straight away. So the tanks are on their own. And talking of tanks on their own, one tank was left in Seseña, the one that was disabled. This one. This one, as I said, it was disabled just by the main square. And as Fernando Lopez says You know, you can imagine this at this point. All of the infantry are converging on this tank, this disabled tank, like a zombie film.
Yeah.
Somebody gets the idea to douse the tank with petrol and set light to it. And as they approach, and obviously the guys in the tank are firing what they can, but you know, you can't fire in all directions at all times. Petrol is thrown on the tank. It's ignited either with one of these flaming rocks or a hand grenade. The tank begins to burn. Petrol leaks into the engine bay, leaks into the fighting compartment, and the guys inside have got to get out. They get out. The next slide is the tank commander, Lieutenant Nikolai Syelitsky. He gets out with his pistol, firing away. His two colleagues do the same, the driver, the gunner. They get out, but they're outgunned, they're outnumbered, and they're out of luck, basically. All three die in the street. They're shot. And so ends the first part of the Battle of Seseña. Now, what do the tanks do from there? Well, they drive on to Esquivias, the next village along. Now, Esquivias is much like Seseña in a way. And if we can go to the next photograph, it's a photograph of Esquivias from that time. You can see the church spire on the left. It's an agricultural type town. There's a hill on the right overlooking the town. Its one claim to fame is that it's got a house which belonged to, if you're not sounds crude, but the Spanish equivalent of Shakespeare, Cervantes. He's the man who wrote Don Quixote.
Okay, cool.
So he had a house here, but that's neither here nor there for this particular presentation.
Yeah, I recognise that reference, and that's all that matters, Pete. Yeah.
Good. So the tanks arrive, and it's effectively a repeat of what they did in the last town in Seseña. The tanks enter, machine gunning, blowing things up left and right as they move from east to west. Esquivias, this town, is held by a cavalry unit, and these guys have actually got their horses with them. So as the tanks drive through the town, they're shooting up all sorts of transport, and that unfortunately includes the horses. So all horses that they find are machine gunned in the street. So it's pretty horrible, but that's the way it goes. The tanks move their way through to the east side. We can see in the bottom left-hand corner, you got the church that we saw in the earlier photo. And the tanks move through this town to the west side of the town there. Some of them come under fire from troops who have been dug in on the hill, but wisely, they don't go up and try and sort of root them out. As they get to the west side of Esquivias, things get interesting again, because they notice, driving at very, well, high speed as far as the T26 is concerned, a number of tanks driving towards Esquivias. Now, what they are small Italian tankettes, CV-35s. And here's an example of one in a museum. Now, as you can see, it's quite dinky, quite nice, small, compact, goes about 40 kilometers an hour. So it can shift, it can move very quickly, but it's only got 10 millimeters of armor protecting it, a two-man crew, and they've only got a couple of machine guns to actually do any damage with. So it's not a particularly effective tank. It's more of a tankette, the sort of things that evolved into the brain carrier. So a number of these, not quite sure how many, between sort of 3 and 8 is what is believed. These have been active in the area, and of course they've been called into Esquivias to give some support to these marauding Soviet tanks. But these things only weigh a third of the T26s. These weigh just under 3 tons. So as they scoot into the town and start firing the machine guns at the T26s fire back with armor-piercing rounds. And you can imagine what's going to happen. But the Italians who are crewing these are actually quite lucky. Only one gets hit in the initial firefight. It's disabled, and then a T26 comes along and rams it. It's the first tank ram in history, and it's this gentleman. If you can bring him up.
There we go. Yep.
Lieutenant Simeone Osechi. He performs the first tank ram in history, hits the small Italian tankette, flips it over and pushes it into a ditch. Fortunately for the Italians inside, they're stuck inside, but they survive the battle. Of course, at this point, the rest of the Italian tankettes decide that it's time to get out there, and that's what they do. If they hang around pinging them machine gun bullets off the side of the tanks, things can only get worse for them. And then the T26s come under artillery fire, not particularly heavy artillery fire, and they notice that outside the village, a battery's been quickly set up, about 4 or 5 field guns, firing shots into the village at the tanks. They get a lucky hit on one of the T26s and it's disabled. One of the tracks is probably broken or the wheels are smashed. So one tank's been disabled, the rest of the tanks return fire. One of the guns that's firing in is knocked out, and the crew suddenly realise that if they're going to hang around there, the same thing's going to happen to them. So they decide to mount a rather rapid retreat, leaving guns behind. Now, it's at this point that not the literal cavalry, cavalry is what's been shot up in Esquivias, but the third attempt to reinforce Esquivias happens, and it's one of these vehicles, which should be the next one. There we go. There's the Bovington CB35, and it's got a trailer because it's a flamethrower tank. And this rolls it into the town. Apparently, the tanks even watch it arrive in town, possibly out of curiosity, possibly out of malice. Who knows? They want to, the cat's playing with the mouse. This pulls into the town, pulls up behind a house. Commander gets the flamethrower ready, prepares, gives the instruction to the driver, okay, head off. They drive up round the corner and immediately hit by at least one shell from the Soviet tanks. The thing's destroyed, the 2 crewmen die. Some people may knock the Italians in the 1930s and early 40s for the state of their equipment, but you can't knock their bravery, that's for certain. So, again, Ardman thinks, right, okay, they're now throwing tanks at us. We're being fired on by artillery. We've got no infantry support. We can't take this town either. So there's no point in hanging around. We may as well drive on. Otherwise, we're sitting ducks, and that's exactly what they do. So the remaining 13 tanks head southeast towards a village called, or town called Badahoth. Of course, they've left behind another tank, and that tank is quickly discovered by the rebels. Another artillery battery is brought up, and about half a kilometre away, it sets up and begins bombarding the tank with the idea of knocking it out. Bearing in mind, anti-tank guns are only now being introduced in October 1936 in this war. You know, we've got small caliber field guns firing at this thing. They're not particularly accurate, and you can tell that by the fact that they reckon it took them half an hour and around 150 shots before they actually hit the tank.
Wow. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
But it's a pretty good shot. They hit the tank just below the turret ring. It penetrates the tank. The shell goes in, explodes, and kills all 3 crewmen. Afterwards, not so much as an autopsy, but they come along. They fish the 3 crew out, and apparently they look at them, and according to at least one source, they could say, "Oh yes, he's Russian, and what's left of him, yeah, he was definitely Spanish." So by the looks of at least one of the Spaniards made it as far as Esquivias and died there. But the rest of the tanks move on to Badahoth. What they do when they get there, we don't know. There don't appear to be any records found as of yet, which detail what happens there. Were there any rebels there? We don't know. If they were they treated in the same way? We don't know. What we do know is that when Ardman gets there, he takes the decision to return back to the start line. The rationale being that if he carries on driving west or driving round and round, he's going to run out of fuel, he's going to run out of ammunition, and then guess what? He's lost 15 valuable tanks, 15 valuable tank crew, and he's not going to get thanked by anybody for doing that. So he's driving back to the start line, and that's what he does. He takes the road back up towards Seseña, where he makes the other decision: how to get through Seseña. Does he drive through the town? In all probability, the defenders there, who will have regrouped by now, may well be waiting for him with barricades and all sorts. He doesn't know. So that's risky. But has the infantry taken Seseña? That's a possibility also. His other alternative is to drive across country, across the sort of ploughed fields. And as I mentioned at the beginning, very open, not much cover. You haven't got any Normandy bocage to hide behind. So anything driving even a kilometre or two to the south of Seseña or to the north of Seseña, you're going to run into trouble if anybody's brought up any artillery to reinforce the town.
So I'm assuming dust as well. Sorry, I mean, that dust columns are going to be seen for miles as well.
Absolutely. So you're not going to get away with bypassing the town that easily. And bearing in mind, he probably hasn't got enough fuel to take a wide berth of the town. So, all of this is playing through his mind. What does he do? Well, he flicks the coin in his mind and decides that the lesser of the two evils is to go back through the town. And that's what he does. So his remaining 13 tanks trundle up towards Seseña. They get to the outer limits of the town, and sure enough, a rudimentary barricade's been thrown across the road again, just in case the tanks come back, which they have. And they drive up, much as they did on the way through. They start to come under attack from infantry, throwing things at them, firing guns, whatever, anything to try and do something to stop these tanks. But it's not until they really get back to the main square in the centre of the town that things get a bit nasty. By then, the infantry have prepared not so much Molotov cocktails. A lot of people say, oh, yes, Battle of Seseña, the first battle in which Molotov cocktails were used. For me, a Molotov cocktail is a bottle full of petrol with a wick in it, set the light, it's thrown, explodes, bursts into flames. It's an all-in-one weapon.
Yep, I concur. Yep.
And the name Molotov cocktail was given by the Finns in the Winter War in 1940 anyway. But what the Spanish managed to realize is that if they fill bottles or similar breakable containers with petrol, put a stopper in the top, through that, then try to ignite the petrol, that was a viable weapon. And that's what they started to prepare in Seseña. So in the main square, these petrol bottles, I won't say petrol bombs because they don't actually explode, are thrown at the tanks. Starts to get a bit hairy, lots of shooting going on. Some of the tanks are hit with the petrol, but they don't ignite, or if they ignite, they don't catch fire in a major way. It's a bit of fire on the tank and it goes out. Except for one tank, which is hit by petrol, and it is hit by a flaming rock or a hand grenade. It starts to burn, and again, petrol leaks into the tank. Any oil at the bottom of the engine bay starts to catch fire, and the crew have to get out. Only two of the crew manage to get out alive. They run down the road, any road, doesn't matter. They're just trying to run for their lives. They run down the road into a building. It's a large building with probably with an inside courtyard or something. They run around the bottom of this building, the ground floor, being pursued by Moroccan infantry, who are obviously trying to catch them and dispatch them. They run out the building, run down the road again, come up, they see a sort of small garden wall about 1 metre tall. They leap across the wall. Unfortunately, there's a 5 metre drop the other side. And that's what happens. They fall, they either sprain their ankle, they're winded, whatever. The Moroccans catch up with them and just shoot them dead on the floor. So that's the end of them. The rest of the tanks fight their way through the town and out the other side. And eventually, getting on for about 7 o'clock in the evening, so they've been going for about 12 hours or more, they get back to the start line, having lost 3 of their tanks. And that, if you like, is the end of the Battle of Seseña. Well, was it worth it? Well, the answer is possibly not. They didn't actually fulfill any objectives. They didn't push the rebels back. They didn't take any territory. They certainly inflicted quite some losses on the enemy. In Seseña, for example, they managed to kill 13 rebel soldiers, wounded 60. Unfortunately, 3 civilians died and another 7 were wounded. But they did manage to destroy 16 cars and light vehicles, 10 trucks, at least 2 field guns, and about 8 farm carts with supplies in. We don't know what the damage was in Esquibia, so I don't think it was actually totaled that up, or what the human cost was. As we know, there was certainly an equine cost. But in terms of whatever happened to the heroes, the people that I've mentioned, obviously we know that Nikolai Silitsky, the commander of the first tank that was destroyed in Seseña or disabled in Seseña, he died. He was awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union for his actions at the end of the year, as was Osadchi, the lieutenant who performed the first ever tank ram in history. He also won the Hero of the Soviet Union, as did Ardman. Unfortunately for Osadchi, in a few days after this particular battle, he's badly wounded in another tank operation. He's taken out, but unfortunately dies 2 weeks later of gangrene. That's in there. But posthumously, both he and Silitsky get the Hero of the Soviet Union. Ardman goes back to the Soviet Union and the USSR at the end of the year. For him, the civil war's over. He's replaced, but he goes back to bigger and greater things. And by the time of Kursk, he's commanding the 122nd Tank Brigade. Participates in the Battle of Kursk, and on the 7th of August 1943, unfortunately, he's shot by a sniper's bullet, and he dies. So 3 heroes of the Soviet Union there. As for the other guy, on the other side, Captain Sanchez Perez, he returns to Morocco after the Civil War. He survives. He gets promoted to colonel and retires in 1955, where he becomes an author until he dies sometime in the late 20th century. So that, if you like, is the Battle of Seseña. The only thing that I will add at the end before we start looking at the World War II aspect is that, as I said earlier, it was a battle of firsts. It was the first tank versus tank battle since World War I. And even then, they only had one tank versus tank battle there. So this is only the second tank versus tank battle in history. You had the first ever tank ram where Osadchi knocked the little Italian thing and flipped it. First time Soviet tanks were used outside the Soviet Union. And it was the first time that petrol was used as an anti-tank weapon. So as you can see, it's not the biggest battle in the world, but from an armored development perspective, it's got quite a few firsts.
And this is where I can see, and we're going to discuss this now. It's how much relevance this has. Does it have almost zero, or does it have lots and lots? And I'm reminded of the Canadians watching the constant use of Dieppe to say, well, we learned this for D-Day. Go, well, Dieppe wasn't anything to do with practicing for D-Day. Anything that you're looking back on it from 2 years later is not really fair. So you could start saying, well, in Barbarossa they did this, or in El Alamein they did that. What about in the desert in 1941? They could, at the time, they weren't thinking about how this would evolve into future things. They're just trying to win a battle on the ground. But this is where I'm interested in your take, because we've got more to go, folks. We're not going anywhere yet. In how where what we learned from this, and how much actual learning was done, and how much kind of people have said learning was done. And we're really interested. We're hanging now for your interpretation, really.
Right. Okay. Well, let's tackle those questions.
Sure.
I think, as I said earlier, you mentioned the Spanish Civil War, and people go, test ground for World War II.
Yeah.
And to a certain extent, that is true. But it's also not true, because of the main reason for the military aid was political. But as you said yourself, Paul, it was a win-win situation, because it then gives the countries who are sending the aid, and aid, I always think of aid, military aid, as a bit of a, I don't know, what's the word?
It's paradox, isn't it? Yeah, military aid. Yeah.
But of course, the benefit they get is then they can then look at how their weapons are being used and say, is this performing as expected? Is it doing better, worse? If it's doing worse, how can we improve on it, etc.? But it's not just those guys. As I said, the British and the French signed up to the Non-Intervention Pact, but they've got military attaches in Spain. So have the Americans, so have lots of people. So a lot of people are looking at what's going on in Spain, thinking, well, this is 20 years after the First World War. how have things progressed in warfare terms? How are things, what's the next war going to be like based upon what's happening here? So the British military attaches, the French, the Americans, and anybody else who's interested are sending reports back home, making notes upon what they've seen, what's going well, what's not. And from there, conclusions are drawn up. So I guess the way I thought about tackling this is to look at this nation by nation. And I'm not going to get into aircraft or anything like that. I'm not an aviation person. I'm looking at this purely, this is an armored warfare presentation.
Pins and rivets. Then let's stick with what your name is. Yeah.
Indeed.
Rivets and pins, rather. Yeah.
Yeah.
I just want to say before we go on, my first takeaway is it's too small a sample size. There's not enough. It's like going into the town of Bradford, for example. I don't know why Bradford, and asking 10 people what their favorite chocolate bar is. It's too small a size. If all 7 like Cadbury's Dairy Milk, you've not really got an indication of what chocolate Bradford likes. That's a weird analogy to go with. But with, we're talking 15 tanks in this particular battle that they didn't all engage. So it's a very small sample size. I know there are other armored engagements in the conflict, but it's not a huge amount.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. And what I've done is to actually look at the war as a whole, not just Seseña, because as you say, 15 tanks on one side and half a dozen tankettes on the other. Nobody's going to draw any major conclusions from that, apart from you don't pitch tankettes with machine guns against tanks.
Yeah.
Which indeed was one of the conclusions that I think everybody came to, that the age of the light tank armed with just machine guns is over. But yeah, various types of armored engagement happened during the Civil War, and conclusions were drawn from that. The one you mentioned, the fact it's the small sample, the Germans looked at that and said, really, this war went on for the best part of 3 years. In terms of large armored engagements, there weren't any.
Yeah, we're not going to learn that from this. No, yeah.
Exactly. I mean, for example, 1937 at Fuentes de Ebro, the Soviet, what was it, the BT-5, the fast tank was used. So you had 50 Russian tanks streaming down the road. But you're not, 50 tanks is what, 2 or 3 companies. It's not massive. So the Germans looked at this and said, we can't draw any major conclusions from this, certainly from an armored perspective. It just doesn't work for us. It's not representative enough. They also picked up on the terrain point. I mentioned earlier that Spain's the second most mountainous country in Europe after Switzerland. The Germans said, well, guess what? We're not going to be fighting the next war in Spain. And in fact, we've got absolutely no designs on Switzerland. So why are we looking at this war in terms of terrain? Yes, there are flat areas in Spain. Of course there are. But if you want to go from one side of the country to the other, you're going to find it very difficult to do that without crossing mountains. So from a terrain perspective, the Germans said, again, this isn't representative of any future European war. The other thing they noted is that when they sent the tanks, and all they sent were the little Panzer ones, which we'll see later, they were used by the Germans to train Spanish crews. When they went into combat, in the early days, there were German crews, and then later on Spanish crews. But anytime the tanks went into combat, they were under Spanish command. And the Spanish army was conservative. It was like a lot of armies at the time. It was loath to take up all of these fancy new machines with armor and guns. As far as they were concerned, they were very useful, but supporting their main infantry, because infantry was where it was at. Artillery supports the infantry, tanks support the infantry, aircraft support the infantry. End of story. Thank you. So the Germans weren't going to make any sort of assessment of tactics using tanks. It just wasn't the place for it. Although, interestingly, when the Germans did manage to convince local Spanish commanders to use, 15, 16 tanks in one company, in one action altogether, and not split them up, 2 over there, 4 over there, 3 over there. It worked. But as von Thoma, the colonel in charge of the tank force, as part of the Condor Legion, he noted that the Spanish army, or the Spaniards in the nationalist army, he said they were very quick to learn and understand, but also very quick to forget. So they'd say, yeah, that worked very well when we put all those tanks together. But anyway, for this operation, we want 3 tanks there, 3 tanks there, and 3 over there. So again, the Germans looked at all of this and said, this is not how we intend to fight in future. So, we're very loath to take any sort of lessons from this. There weren't enough tanks and they weren't used to their own maximum potential. It just didn't happen. But what I did notice, and if we can go to the next slide, is that these things were very useful. And hopefully we'll see an anti-tank gun.
There we go. Yep.
That's the one. Now, if you're interested in early World War II tanks and anti-tank guns, there's your PaK 36, your 37mm anti-tank gun. This is the first conflict where purpose-built anti-tank guns are seen in the battlefield. They didn't have them in the First World War, and obviously in Seseña they certainly didn't have them. But around this time, in other areas, they're starting to appear. The Germans have delivered a lot of these PaK 36s, and as you can see, they're small. You can maneuver them with the crew. You can walk them around the battlefield. You can hide them quite easily, and they punched holes in the tanks that were being operated. As I said, 15mm of armor was the maximum you had on the T26, and these things could perforate that armor very easily. The Russians had their own version, the 45mm version, which I think is the next slide, built under license from the Germans. You got the same gun shield and the same sort of carriage, just the guns are the bigger Soviet gun, thicker barrel for a start. But these weapons on the battlefield posed a very lethal threat to tanks, and I think every nation that observed what was going on in Spain came to the conclusion that if you've got these, then you may not have to worry so much about tanks coming at you. So the Germans certainly recognized this. Now, on the next slide, we can see one of the CB-35s. So this is one of the little tankettes that was...
and when you send me that photo, it looks like that bloke has been photoshopped on at a bigger scale. You kind of, your brain is telling you it can't really be that small. He must be enormous, but of course it is that small. It
is that small. And and that's why a T26 was able to ram it, flip it on its roof, and push it into a ditch. It's tiny, not well armored, not well armed. And the Germans looked at this. They looked at their own light tank, which is the next one, the Panzer I. Again, this is a much more advanced vehicle. It's got a turret, 360-degree turret. It's got, again, 2 machine guns. Technically, much more advanced than the little Italian tankette. The problem is it only has machine guns. The Germans quickly learned that the way to tackle T26s with these was to get up close and fire armor-piercing bullets. And up to about 100 meters or so, they were quite effective. The problem being that the T26 drivers crews soon realized that they don't get near these things. They kept their distance and shot at these things from a distance and destroyed them. So the Germans came to the conclusion that light tanks are great if you use them as light tanks. So if you want to use them for sort of flanking work with infantry or as reconnaissance vehicles, then yeah, they're probably still pretty good. And the Germans certainly continued to use light tanks into 1944-45 with the looks. So the concept wasn't bad. It's how you used these things which was questionable. If you use them as a combat tank, you're going to run into problems. And so the Germans decided, okay, understand, best not to do that. Now, if you think about it, you can say, well, hold on, they may have come to that conclusion, but they were using Panzer Is in Poland, in France, and even into the Soviet Union in 1941. Well, yeah, that's because they didn't have enough combat tanks. So to actually equip their forces, they stuffed the empty tank companies with Panzer Is and Panzer IIs in order just to keep up the numbers.
Well,
And
as
as
you
soon
say,
as
if you use them for the right purpose, they're still capable of doing something. It's just don't do things with them that they can't do.
exactly, you know, if you're up against an infantry unit which hasn't got any anti-tank weapons, these things are still going to cause a lot of damage, a lot of mayhem, and probably win you the battle. But if you're going against a tank or an anti-tank gun, then yeah, you got problems. So the Germans looked at these and said, okay, yeah, combat tanks in the future are going to need a gun, a cannon on the front, something that can fire, you know, like the Soviet tanks did in Seseña, fire a high explosive shell or an armor-piercing shell at the enemy, not just machine guns. And they also observed the fact that they needed better armor. 15mm was like, if you like, the medium tank standard for the early 30s. The British were following that, the Germans, the Soviets. It's only the French who are sort of beefing up their armor on their sort of Renault 35s and things with sort of, you know, much thicker armor. But the Germans quickly concluded that that's no longer sustainable. We can't have such thin armor on the front of our combat tanks. So with their Panzer III, as soon as they got it into serious mass production, here it is, the Ausführung E, the E version. This is the one that went into mass production first. The first four versions were all, if you like, production trial production, pre-production versions. This thing actually had 30mm of armor. So, and it went up from there to 50 and beyond. So those are the conclusions that the Germans came to regarding their tanks. Now, the other weapon that we need to address here in terms of anti-tank is this one, the Flak 18, the dreaded 88. As the Flak 18, then the improved model was 36, 37, and whatever. 71 of these were sent to Spain, and they were sent as anti-aircraft guns. It was anticipated that the Spanish Air Force could well attack German-run airfields, etc. So they ended up sending over 70 of these down to Spain, and they were set up around airfields and the like. But the Germans soon realized that the Spanish rebels had very limited artillery. Not a lot of it, and what there wasn't that good. And they knew that they could use these things for indirect fire, so sort of firing, you know, from a few miles away up and then down onto the target. Great. They soon realized that, well, this thing fires quite high velocity shells, so they can fire at ground targets also. So they started to take out pillboxes and bunkers and dug in positions. That again worked quite well. And obviously at some point, somebody said, Werner, can you hit that tank over there? Werner had a go. Werner put the shell through the tank and destroyed it. And so was born the 88 as an anti-tank weapon. Now, interestingly, out of the, was it 378 combat engagements the 88 had in Spain, only 31 were against aircraft. So 92%, my maths is right, 92%.
Yeah, sounds about right to me, yeah.
92% of the times they used these guns was against ground targets, which kind of sort of says it all, really. Now, as a result of that, what you tended to find is that they only used the high explosive shells in Spain because it's what, 9.5 kilos worth of steel and high explosive. That's traveling at 2,800 kilometers an hour. If that hits a tank with only 15mm of armor, it's going to make a mess. And in fact, I've tried to look for pictures of T26s hit by 88s, and there aren't any. Probably right, because there weren't any T26s left after being hit by an 88.
Yeah, yeah.
But the Germans did take a couple of lessons away for this gun, apart from the obvious one that this is a really good gun for ground targets. The first lesson was, why don't we actually come up with a purpose-built armor-piercing shell? And they began work on that in 1938. I don't think any actually made it to Spain. They didn't need to be in Spain because the high explosive could destroy any tank on the battlefield at the time. But they had one ready for 1939 and 1940. The other point is on the next slide. Here's, I don't know whether that's, I think that's a Flak 36, but it's the same gun, basically, just a slightly improved version. But if you notice, you've got a big gun shield on that. Why? Because in the Spanish Civil War, they were using these as ground support guns, and they were taking them fairly close to the front where they could sort of see and fire on pillboxes and bunkers and the like. By getting up close, they were vulnerable to machine gun fire and enemy fire. And in fact, after aircrew, the group of Condor Legion members who had the most casualties were 88 crews, because they were taking them too close to the front. They had no gun shield, and a lot of them were getting shot. So hence the gun shield you see introduced on these tanks as we go into World War II. So that kind of wraps up what the Germans concluded from the war. So, and they come up with, you know, what I think was some very rational, reasonable conclusions.
And just very brief, because I don't want to get bogged down in my comments because I'm not the expert. I think when people are thinking of any connections the Germans would make between the Civil War and World War II, it would be with regards Blitzkrieg, the early phase of the war. But actually, the anti-tank gun is more skipping a bit to the next phase of the war, perhaps in North Africa and things, when the Germans are more engaged in defensive warfare, because that's when your anti-tank gun stuff, and they're not really coming into their own, you know, in France in 1940 or the Netherlands, but later on, desert campaigns. So this is interesting stuff, Pete. Really enjoying it.
Yeah, as I say, Germany, like most of the other nations, saw the value in anti-tank guns. You know, this was the first time they've been used in anger, and just to go back a bit to the little Pak 36s, the little 37mm ones. You know, they were small little tank guns, and by the end of World War II, they're next to useless. But what you found in the Spanish Civil War is they could put a hole through anything they came across. So much so that what the Condor Legion did was to assign 5 anti-tank guns to every tank company to give their Panzer Is with the machine guns the opportunity to actually fight back with the Russian tanks. So yeah, it was quite interesting. The fact that this was quite a revelation to everybody concerned, that these tiny little anti-tank guns were effectively a very effective answer to the terror of the tank. Now, almost in contrast to all of these German conclusions about weaponry, tactics, what the next war is going to look like, the Italians kind of drew the opposite conclusions. They had a lot of men on the ground making some very good observations and feeding all of that back to the Italian army back in Italy. Unfortunately, not much attention seems to have been paid to them. They were coming up sort of saying, well, yeah, the CB-35 is great, but the problem is not as a combat tank. We need armored cars, a bit like these Soviet ones, the BA-6s with the big gun on the back. So, we need fast, well-armed, well-armored cars. Stuff like this was being fed back all the time. Unfortunately, the top brass in Italy looked at this. They looked at their successes in Malaga in 37. They looked at when they advanced into the Basque country in sort of 37 and is it 30? I can't remember. The date's getting a bit sketchy here. But, the Italians felt they did well. The top brass, if you like, they dwelt on that and thought, yeah, we did pretty well and we were on the winning side. So, why change? Things are looking good. So, yes, some improvements were made. They began work to come up with a tank with a turret, but on the whole, they didn't take that much away with them in terms of lessons learned. Then come the Soviets, and they spent a heck of a time looking at the war, looking at different aspects of it, what went well, what went bad. Big lists of stuff. These were the guys who actually probably did the most work in this out of all of the nations who built tanks. And they drew lots of very good conclusions. Lots of actions came out of this to the benefit of the Red Army. Things like their tanks, they needed a good command and control structure for their tanks. Communication was key, so that tanks could communicate with infantry, tank units could communicate with each other. They recognized that they needed to have decent, correct, regular maintenance schedules. When the Italians and Germans sent their tankettes over, their Panzer Is and CB-35s, they sent over maintenance teams with them to keep them running, keep them working properly. The Soviets, not so much. And of course, after a while, your tanks start becoming unavailable because they're not working anymore, and you haven't got the spare parts for them. So again, a valuable takeaway for the Soviets. Obviously, they recognized the superiority of their own tanks against the light tanks. Wasn't, it's not something that could be ignored or overlooked. And they made changes to the way that they were building their tanks. The T26, for example, that we saw in Seseña, they modified the engine deck, so it wasn't so easy for burning petrol to leak into the engine deck. It, run off the sides rather than into the tank. So lots of things like this, lots of lessons learned. And if you think of Soviet advances with the tank riders, infantry holding onto the side of the T-34s, on going into battle, that occurred for the first time in the Spanish Civil War. It was a bit of a last-minute thought. The tank unit who were doing this, and it was the BT5s, they were given 2 hours notice that, oh, by the way, when you go into action, you're going to be carrying a load of infantry on the back. Problem is, the infantry didn't have anything to hold on to, so you can imagine it all got a bit messy. Nasty business. But the concept, they took note of the concept, took it back to the Soviet Union, and obviously it went from there. But they also made a few blunders. The biggest one being that they looked at the Spanish Civil War and said, this is how conflict in the European theatre is going to happen from now on. This is the future of warfare in Europe. They concluded the complete opposite to the Germans. And as a result, this was one of the factors that led to them starting to sort of disband their large mechanized forces in favor of sort of pushing out the tanks to the infantry, much in the same way that the Spanish did. So it was one of those factors. So they put a lot of thought into it, but they didn't get everything right. So those are the three, if you like, participant countries.
Yeah. And it's interesting that as you explain that, not only is some of it their own kind of confirmation bias, they're looking for the things that they think work and proving they do work. They're also thinking about the future wars they may be in when we talked about Italian armored doctrine a few weeks ago. They're thinking about potential conflicts in North Africa or perhaps with Greece. They're not necessarily thinking about different types of terrain. Russia, the Soviet Union, distance, so maintenance becomes very important because you may be covering more distances. So they're applying kind of the rules of engagement from potential conflicts they may be involved in. So they're drawing different conclusions from the same events, but they have different reasons to draw those conclusions for.
Exactly. And of course, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't.
Yeah.
In terms of other tank building nations, if you look at France, for example, again, it didn't take part in the Spanish Civil War. It kind of gave the government a bit of help towards the end, but nothing major. But again, France looked at what was going on and drew its own conclusions. Like the Soviet Union, it thought, okay, a future European war is going to be very much like we're seeing in Spain. They took that as being the norm. But on the other hand, again, like everybody else, they looked at anti-tank guns and thought, yes. So if we have a strong defense and we fill it full of anti-tank guns as well, then we don't really need to fear any tanks coming over the border from Germany. And as a result, they didn't think they had reason to change in the way they were fighting battles. I mean, a lot of their tanks were much more highly armored, or thickly armored rather, than what they saw in Spain. So they drew comfort from that. Possibly falsely.
And also, just sorry to interrupt you again.
Oh, fine.
We mustn't forget as well that these nations have maybe got a 20-year doctrinal plan that has been, but you can't just suddenly reverse everything you've been doing for the last 20 years. You can make adaptations to what you're doing, but France has got a way it's going to set about going to war, Russia, and so on. So that having an idea that revolutionizes, there's not the money to revolutionize everything. So you've kind of got to stick to some extent with the plan you've got, but then maybe adapt it based on what you found out locally.
Exactly. And as you say, the French have already invested a lot in their defenses, in their armored forces, etc. Yeah. So it's very hard to rip all of that up and start again.
Yeah.
But we'll look at the US in a minute, but the US were a bit more fortunate in that respect, but we'll come to those in a second. Just want to look at the UK's response because, you know, like the UK, sorry, like France, they also had military attaches reporting back on what they saw, what they observed, what went well, etc. Now, they came to the same conclusion as the Germans. This is Spain. It's a different country. We're not going to be operating in these sort of environments in future. Very unlikely. Again, they noted the effectiveness of the anti-tank guns. Fuller, Little Heart, light tanks. Okay, light tanks are good as light tanks, but not as main tanks. Anti-tank guns, great idea. We'll go with those. So they didn't change the concept of their cruiser tanks and their infantry tanks. They didn't see any reason to, from what they've witnessed in Spain. But they did come to the same conclusion as the Germans, that the armor on their cruiser tanks, which again was, if you like, almost an international standard of about 14 to 15 millimeters thick, that's not going to cut the mustard. So the tank we've got on screen now, the A13, that's the Mark 1, the Cruiser 3. In production, they built 65 of these like this with the big square turrets, but they soon realized that the 15 millimeters of armor, 15 millimeters of armor at the front, not good enough. So they quickly came up with a revised version, which we'll see here, and a markedly different turret. It looks a bit like a Crusader turret.
It does, doesn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, but it's the same turret as before, but with spaced armor over the top, increasing the thickness on the sides. The turret fronts, or certainly the whole fronts and the turret fronts, were increased to 30 millimeters of armor, just to bring it up a notch, to give it a bit more protection against the anti-tank guns that they'd seen in Spain. What else was there for the British? Well, I guess the good news for them, and the reason not to change, because they were fitting their new 2-pounder gun, 40 millimeter anti-tank gun, to all of their cruiser tanks and their infantry tanks. We'll ignore the Matilda one. That's a bit of a dinosaur, so we'll put that to the back. And of course, their 2-pounder gun was ideal. That with a machine gun, and you've got similar to what you've got on the T26. Okay, HE capability is not that great. And I don't think they actually issued many, if any, shells in France anyway, or North Africa. But they thought with this gun, this can fight other tanks. So all things are good. Beef up the armor, away we go. So those are the conclusions that the British came to. So all in all, not bad. We'll give them a better mark than some of the other nations.
And now the US.
Now the US. Now what you got here. Let's just look at what the US are doing. The US are, if you like, whereas other countries are up to their knees in armor development, the US is still dipping its big toe in. To use an anatomical metaphor.
We've done Viz. We might as well do bodily parts now. Yeah.
I'll keep it at toes and knees if you don't mind. The most numerous tank in the American armory in sort of the mid-1930s was this little thing here, the M2A3, or the M2A2 was the plentiful one, the most numerous, but it's very similar to the M2A3. The M3 had a little bit more, the A3 had a bit more armor. But again, you've got two little turrets on the top. You can't see that from the side. Two little turrets, both with a machine gun. The Americans quickly realized that, hey, these aren't going to last very long on the battlefield after what we've seen in Spain. So they quickly beefed this up to an A4 model. So you've got the M2A3 going to an M2A4, one turret and a 37mm gun. And it looked very suspiciously like the next tank, because this is what it becomes. It becomes the M3 Stuart. And interestingly enough, the M3 Stuart, you got that typical American suspension that we also see on the Lee and on the Sherman. But if you put the weedy little suspension that we see on the T26 on there, effectively the Americans copied the T26 for the M3 or the M2, which becomes the M3. So the Americans beefed up what they were producing. They started to look at medium tanks, the M2 medium tank, M3, and so on from there. And they're in a fortunate position because they didn't have loads of tanks that suddenly might become obsolete if they changed their minds about how they want to use tanks. So from that perspective, they were quite fortunate. It's a bit like Tesla and General Motors. Tesla comes along, brand new. It can invest in brand new systems, brand new factories, bingo. Whereas General Motors have got very ancient systems and factories that have been there for a long time. They can't change so quickly. Similarly here. Other observations that the Americans made, again, anti-tank guns, big thumbs up. They saw the effectiveness and the benefit of those. Again, they saw the disparity between the Soviet tanks and the German and the Italian tanks. And they realized that machine gun only tanks were no good. Hence, we saw with the M2 being upgraded to the M3 eventually. They also noted that tanks weren't being used correctly. They were being parceled up into groups of 3, platoons of 3 or 4, and used ineffectively like that. And they also observed poor training, poor coordination between tanks and infantry and artillery. And they noted that the quality of the vehicles down there, in particular the Italian and Soviet tanks, it wasn't that great. So those are sort of the conclusions that the USA came to. Of the other tank building nations, apologise to any Hungarian or Romanian or Swedish viewers, but I didn't really have time or
there's only so much you can do in one show, Pete. Yeah,
exactly. So that's kind of my take on the impact of, if you like, armor development, armor tactics, armor doctrine that the tank building nations and tank using nations took from the Spanish Civil War.
Well, brilliant. And I mean, and you know, my takeaway there, Pete, is, you know, that although we didn't go through the entire armored engagement of the Spanish Civil War, 3 years, the one thing that none of the participant or observing nations could have realized is how much steeper the armored technology would increase once 1939 kicks around. I mean, you know, the difference between an armor being just thick enough and then not being thick enough 6 months later, a gun, the 2-pounder being good enough and then suddenly being out of date, all this, none of the nations could have foreseen how quickly a tank that was top of the line was going to become out of date. And the same would apply equally to aircraft, and I guess even some shipping as well. So that's the thing that no one could really have seen.
Exactly. You know, World War II begins and effectively you end up in an arms race.
Yeah.
Nation A comes up with a more thickly armored tank, so you need a much more powerful gun to penetrate that and put it out of action. So you come up with a tank that's got even thicker armor, and so on. And you're right. Back in the Spanish Civil War, you know, it's this period between the two wars where you've got tanks going from 4 miles an hour up to a heady 18 miles an hour in the Spanish Civil War. Yeah. And then from then on, you know, you're ending up with like things like the M18 Hellcat, which can travel at over 50 miles an hour. So yeah, you're right. Looking at the Spanish Civil War, you know, if they could have seen in 1936 what was happening in 42, 43, 44, then, you know, I don't think they would have believed it.
No, but it's still worth studying in its own right, but without over-egging it. As Jonathan Ware would say, you know, that let's not read more into it than is there, but what there is worth looking at and seeing how lessons were learned and how things would change. And, you know, just even the use of the 88 there is a single takeaway we can take away from this. But I think, well, that's it. I think we'll bring it to an end because otherwise we'll be here all night. But basically, you've earned yourself an invitation to come back again because you've been really good and people have been sticking with this. And given that the We Have Ways pod started half an hour ago, we've still got viewers here. They haven't all gone away. So you were doing well. In fact, viewer numbers have stayed pretty level. So that's good. So have you enjoyed talking to our group tonight, Pete?
Indeed. No, it's been
come
great.
Back again.
Thank
Brilliant.
you very much.
I will just remind people what we got coming up, and I'll come back and say goodbye to you in a second. So, folks, Tomorrow evening, Daniel Bolger, a retired American general, is taking us through the American 3rd Armored Division, and we're going back to the Ardennes to look at how exactly they fought in that engagement, having taken lessons from early in the war. There are more things coming up in the week. Prit Buttar, Nicholas Moran, Chieftain coming up later on. But as usual, you can see what we got coming up on YouTube. Once again, don't forget to follow what we're doing on social media, but consider becoming a patron, maybe consider becoming a YouTube member. Pete's Twitter account is there in the description below to get more of your daily dose of armored information. And the fact he comes highly regarded by people like Nick Bard and others, Jonathan Ware, is proven tonight by his incredible knowledge. So there we go. So thank you very much, Pete. Thank you very much, everybody watching. I will see you all tomorrow evening to do the 3rd Armour. And later on, folks, tonight, I'm recording a podcast with an American channel, so I've got to stay up till 3:30 this morning. I'm either going to go to bed and get up again, or I'm going to stay up, and I'm recording a podcast where they're asking me about Normandy. So it's not over for me tonight. But anyway, it is over for me right now. So see you all again tomorrow. This is Paul Woodadge, World War II TV, saying thank you very much for joining us. Cheers, everybody. Bye.
Good night.